Um, Welcome. So I'm going to talk about a, a captively rearing a project that included that involved captively raising an endangered freshwater turtle and before doing head starting activities in Massachusetts. Um, and I do want to recognize the principal investigators of this research, Brian Windmiller and his colleagues, Emily Wilder and Cara from Zoo New England. And I'm Thilina Surasinghe from Bridgewater State University. So, turtles generally, well, freshwater turtles, marine and terrestrial combined, they have an interesting evolutionary history. We can trace back their evolution back to about 210 million years ago. That's like the Triassic time frame. Um, and interestingly, the body sizes have changed significantly. Where we actually see quite smaller body sizes in the freshwater turtles, but their ancestral forms have large body sizes. Although the completeness of the carapace and the plastron have also evolved over the time, the general body plan of the turtle have remained interestingly the same. Um, so the evolutionary history, this 210 million years long evolutionary history predates many other tetrapods. So, um, and turtles, despite this impressive evolutionary history and despite the fact that they actually, there are many turtle taxa that have gone extinct, like the ones that on the top two images, they have lasted this long, but they are in trouble. Among freshwater turtles, we about know 328 described species. Out of all of those, the IUCN Red List have only assessed 271, meaning like there's a large number of turtles. About approximately about 5% of the freshwater turtles remain unassessed. We don't know about their conservation status. Among the species that are assessed, we have about 68 critically endangered, nearly 50 endangered, about 8 species extinct, and 56 considered vulnerable. So altogether, right, if you look at the most recent assessments that were done outside the conventional red list assessment, if you look at those, over half of the known species of freshwater turtles are threatened with extinction. Now compare that with other vertebrates. Well, slightly over 10% of the birds are threatened with extinction. When I say threatened, I'm piling up critically endangered, and vulnerable altogether. And then about um, a quarter of the non-mammal species fall into that group. Look at flowering plants, about a third of non-flowering plants are threatened with extinction. So, if you do a cross taxa comparison, turtles are facing a disproportionate high level of threats with extinction, probably comparable to that of amphibians. And among other reptiles, they most definitely, their threat levels have been accentuated over the years. So if you look at this map which identifies Kelonian species hotspots or species richness hotspots, the redder colorations indicates increased relatively greater species richness. The blue purple colors indicates relatively lower species richness. So the parts that I am pointing with circles, those clearly are the global hotspots, right? We can understand, the Amazon basin, and in the United States we have southeastern US, and then in the Asian realm we recognize the Brahmaputra Ganges river basin, and then some of the southeastern Asian islands, as well as the mainland, the Indo-Malayan mainland, are clearly recognizable as turtle diversity hotspots. And here we are talking about non-marine forms. But now, to be fair, these hotspots are not only, hot in terms of species richness and diversity, but they are equally hot in terms of the threats they encounter. Now, sort of the forgotten realms of turtle diversity are actually like the northern latitudes. In the United States, if you go towards the northern latitudes like New England area, you don't see that many turtle species. For example, my study site, that's our study site, that's in Massachusetts. We only have about 9 native turtle species. So we don't have that much high diversity. But that itself creates a problem. Now, turtles do have a role in their environment. They are predators in freshwater habitats. They could be scavengers, and some of them play an important role in terms of seed dispersal. And with their greater movement ranges, they not only contribute to this movement of the seeds over a great distance, but they could also transport nutrients, carbon. But so the problem is, if we lose species, um, turtle species from ecoregions where you don't have a greater diversity, well, there isn't an overwhelmingly large number of species to create the portfolio effect, right? And even if you're undergoing population decline in those northern latitudes, you don't actually have probably you don't have enough populations to statistically average and functionally account for the species that are lost. So the implications of population decline and species extinction, local species extirpation in terms of turtles, could be disproportionately high. The ecosystem effects could be more detrimental in areas where you have a lower turtle species richness. Now what are the threats encountered by freshwater turtles? Well, freshwater turtles are largely wetland species. There are some species that occupy open water habitats, rivers and ponds, but largely, even those that occupy rivers and ponds also require wetlands. So wetland degradation, damage, pollution have a greater impact. And then, turtles move around for mating purposes, for um, foraging purposes, for nesting purposes. They actually navigate across the land. They leave the wetlands. So in those movements, they could actually face road collisions. Yeah. So the wetland modification, urbanization, agriculture, for the purpose of agriculture, could imperil them. And then we know, like worldwide, the pet trade or harvesting them for medicinal and food purposes could be a major reason. And then speaking of turtles, freshwater turtles particularly, there is the populations face a disproportionately high levels of mortality in the nesting stage as well as in the hatchling stage. So this subsidized predation by human commensal species could be a problem for them. And then last but not the least, invasive species. There are increasing evidence that the red-eared slider in their northern invaded populations are actually creating competitive disadvantages for the native species. And not to mention, the red-eared sliders could be behaviorally very aggressive. That itself could have many behavioral complications for the native turtles. Now, the species that we are going to talk about today are Blanding's turtle. In terms of the conservation status, IUCN lists it as endangered, and then the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species lists that in the Appendix 2. So you cannot, international trade of this particular species requires specific permits. You cannot use it for non-research, non-educational purposes. It can only be moved between nations, city, administrative boundaries for research purposes or conservation purposes only. Now, in United States, and the species occurs in both US and Canada, right? It's a species with a northern latitudinal distribution. So the species at state level in Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and South Dakota, the species is considered endangered at state level from a state endangered and natural history programs. So in New York, Minnesota, and Ohio, the species is considered threatened, and in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nebraska, it's listed as a species of special concern. Um, and in Canada, the population in Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River and is considered threatened by the federal listing status in Canada, and Nova Scotia populations are considered endangered. And also, interestingly, the nature reserve classification, if you look at them, the global status of the species is considered as apparently secure, G4, but their statewide classification, if you look at that, everywhere except Nebraska, um, Nebraska is the only state where it is considered apparently secure. Every other state actually have a non-secure status, including South Dakota, where it is considered possibly extinct, right? And then those two states aside, everywhere else, you actually have the status of the turtle is considered critically imperiled, or vulnerable, right? So the turtle has a wider distribution in North America. Particularly these Great Lake populations, or this northern Midwestern population range is pretty large. Despite that, at individual state, the species is in some sort of a conservation need or requires conservation attention. And clearly, its northeastern distribution is much more smaller and spotty. So now, let's talk about some basic natural history of this particular species. It's predominantly aquatic. It associates a number of wetland habitats, and in fact, during its life cycle, as well as within a particular year between seasons, this particular species is known to associate different types and different sizes of wetlands. So the between wetland movement has been supported with radio telemetry studies, including in our area. And that this movement could be attributable to them tracking foraging grounds that are more profitable. It could be seeking for high fitness partners, and also looking for nesting and overwintering sites, because these guys are known to overwinter largely in more rather permanent habitats, and they also live natural areas. In fact, some studies have shown that turtles in general inhabit areas outside conservation lands. So it's not something just endemic problem for landing turtles. It's a problem for all turtles. When they pick habitats, generally during the active season, we find them in open canopy wetlands with soft, mucky, organic matter-rich soft bottoms, and with a very high density vegetation cover, but not at the tree level, but at shrub, scrub, and herb level. So you don't find them quite often in ponds, lakes, or rivers or streams, or in forested swamps. Once in a while you could, but not often. They are primarily carnivorous, but there are evidence suggesting some, in certain populations, some herbivory, significant levels of herbivory, at least in certain seasons, and scavenging. In terms of nesting, at least our population in Massachusetts, they nest sort of during the end of May to throughout June, and they utilize well-drained loose soil that is either sandy or loamy predominantly, and the nesting grounds should be exposed to sunlight with little to no vegetation. In fact, there's a lot of vegetation. The problem is not just the shading, but also the roots of the vegetation could prevent digging behavior or the nest construction behavior. And the nesting grounds could be farmlands, agricultural fields, backyards, home gardens. It's kind of interesting that they actually can use anthropogenic habitats and probably prefer to use those over other natural habitats. Um, Average clutch sizes, on average, it's about 10. And in fact, when it comes to nesting, the cold temperatures could be the limiting factor for their range in its northern range. In the southern range, it's actually rather competition and predation and other interspecific interactions. So, um, now, why are we doing a head start for this turtle? Well, because like I mentioned earlier, they kind of have the type 3 survivorship curve, so their mortality is extremely high in early life history stages. So they also have very low winter survival, and the predation by human commensals are extremely high. Um, and their development is also very slow, so there is actually a huge time frame, about 20 years, where they may actually, not they are not contributing to recruitment. So in Massachusetts, on there, the species is fairly well studied and monitored. There are about 3 populations that we have been monitoring, where we have about over 50 adults in each population, and the largest, more the robust population is in Oxbow National Wildlife Refuge. It's a federal land, and then Park River, again another federal land, about 100 species, and Great Meadows, about 60 species. So the last one and the first one, actually, sort of, those are the two that we have been using as source population for head starting and monitoring. And then we actually monitor females, as you see in this image. There's a radio color in this female, rather radio tag. So we radio tags females that we capture. We monitor their movements, and we actually closely monitor during the nesting season and where they nest. And when we locate the nest, we actually protect the nest like this to prevent predation. And when the hatchlings emerge, well, depending on what source population we are looking at, we either let the hatchlings emerge and collect them as emerging hatchlings, or actually after about 2 months of incubation in the nest, we collect the nests and incubate them artificially. So the actual head starting happens, interestingly, in schools, in high schools and middle schools, public schools, and we also let and the Zoo New England themselves and the New England Aquarium also contribute with head starting. So it's interesting. We have experts contributing to head starts and those who learn it from scratch. So on average, in a given year, we could follow about 15 females. There are other females, it's hard to follow all of them. And in terms of the nest of all of those, we are only monitoring about 9. So understandably, certain, like natural nesting grounds where it's happening in the conservation lands outside the anthropogenic areas, it's kind of hard to monitor, and we cannot monitor all the females we are following, and not every female that are reproductively active nests. So we, on average, are able to monitor and guard protect about 9 nests. So here you can see a nest, hatchlings emerging out of the nest, and you can see over here how small those hatchlings are, and this is a nesting female. So now a word about the captive rearing. You have to keep these turtles between 78 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. If the water temperature exceeds about 85 degrees, that could lead to mortality. Turtles can tolerate colder temperatures, but if the water is colder, the turtles don't grow as big as we need them to be. So, and also, as you can see in this over here, we want the aquarium to be sort of slanted, right? At the deep end, we need about 5 inches of water depth, and later on we need about 8 inches. And on the shallower end, we need the water to be as shallow as possible, where the turtle can actually still have its paws, its limbs on the aquarium floor, but should be able to reach the ground, reach air for breathing purposes. And we tell the captive rearing crew to watch for signs of diseases, sign of stress, sign of damage, behavioral abnormalities, and every month they're supposed to record their weight and length, right, and send it to us. And this happens to about 5-6 months, actually 4 to 5 months. And feeding is really important, right? And the feeding changes an early to late. Early we actually feed them in the aquarium. Later on we actually feed them in individual cages. Early we feed them with pelleted food or turtle jellies, and then later we actually provide them live food. We want to feed them twice a day. And this is sort of the list of equipment they want to have, or we provide them when these work, when certain schools participate in turtle rearing. Now, why do we need to do the head start just to iterate certain facts? We need to grow them sort of cross a threshold where quite large enough so that the size dependent mortality is lower, and also to eliminate predation risks, which is also related to size dependent mortality. If you increase the body size beyond a certain limit, then of course most predators cannot handle them, right, like water snakes for example, or the other human commensals. Now captive hatchlings are kept in different institutes, yet in similar environmental conditions, and since 07 we have done about nearly 800 captive rearing, and we release them back into 5 suitable sites for continuous growth and recruitment for population augmentation processes. And all of those sites that we release them back to are parts of the historical range, right? So what we do here, this is a very preliminary study. So we actually, what I'm presenting you is preliminary data. Now I know a basic idea about what's going on. I can do advanced statistics. So we did a univariate permutation test where the response variables were growth rate, final weight, carapace length, and the body conditioning index. Predictors: hatchling year, maternal identity, where the captive institute, hatchling sex, source populations, and the initial size parameters. So now when you consider body conditioning index as the response variable, the hatchling year and the rearing institutes immediately showed up as more critical drivers. And then carapace length, the both weight and the length at hatchling, at the stage of hatchling, also turn out to be significant predictors. And then if you look at the final weights as the response variable, hatchling year and the rearing institute both turn out to be more important predictors. And as you can see, the maternal identity and the sex became close to significant, right? And kind of interesting to notice that their sum of squares are actually relatively high. Now, if you look at the final carapace length, the body length, right, then the hatchling year and the rearing institute turn out to be extremely important. Source population sort of turn out to be important as it approaches significance. And then how about the growth rate, the rate of weight change? Well, now we actually see a lot more features emerging. Hatchling year, rearing institute are driving this trend, and then of course weight at hatchling is really important. That actually is not surprising to get that one. And then also and then you can see the sex and the maternal identity were also significant drivers. So and then looking at the carapace length change, again hatchling year, length at hatchling were significant drivers, and the rearing institute, all three were significant drivers. Now collectively looking at all of those, like if you look at all the possible predictors, hatchling year and the captive institute were responsible significantly and highly significantly were driving all of those response variables, right? So meaning that some institutes are doing a better job at captive rearing than others, right? It's not surprising, but kind of it helps us to understand which institute to keep recruiting in future and which ones to give up. And hatchling here, well, it's actually, more of the it tells you that maybe it's an indication of the maternal fitness, because in certain years certain eggs have higher fitness and certain years they don't. Or it could be the temperature under which they are incubated in the first 2 months before we collect them. Maybe that matters. So, and definitely there's an environmental influence there, despite the captive rearing component. For growth rate, maternal identity emerged as a significant factor. In other cases, that did not emerge as a significant factor. And the sex also mattered. Again, that doesn't surprise, it is not totally surprising, because like the energy allocation in somatic growth versus sexual reproduction can be different between sexes. And in terms of and of course the initial weight does matter to dictate the growth rate. That has been observed repeatedly in many reptiles. The final body weights were driven by hatchling and captive institute, so that those things are actually not surprising. The body conditioning index, I'm not totally sold on BCI as a good um, response variable, because if you can remember from this particular slide, right? In this particular slide, you can see, there's a very high residual leftover, so that is not the totally cool model. So I'm not too excited about that. Probably I don't want to use BCI as a good predictor variable. So well, that's it. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.